You ready to do it?
I'm ready.
All right, let's make sure we're recording. All right, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Guy McPherson here, and I am very excited to have as my guest today, Ilyse Kennedy. Ilyse, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So Ilyse is a therapist, a group practice owner, and author who offers trauma-informed therapy for children, teens, and adults in South Austin, Texas. Ilyse attributes her passion for this work to her very first therapist. She says each time she stepped into her office, she felt fully seen and delighted in. She says she didn't offer tools or interventions. She didn't try to change or cure me. I don't remember what we talked about, but I can still feel how her eyes lit up when I entered her office. That is how I hope to make folks feel when they step into my office. That is awesome. We'll get to that. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Before we get going, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
So I'm originally from Boston. I'm now in Austin, Texas, but I also have to mention that I lived in LA for 8 years, and I feel much more like a California girl than a Texas girl.
Why'd you move to Texas?
My husband was in a band, and the lead singer moved to Texas sort of without telling the rest of the band. And then he opened a food truck and we were like, oh, I guess he lives there now.
Oh my gosh.
And so we followed for the band and for cheaper cost of living, but ended up really enjoying it besides the political factors of Texas.
Yeah. I've never been to Austin. I've heard great things about it. How long have you been there?
We have been here, let's see, almost 10 years now.
Oh, wow. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, Ilyse, let's jump in here. How did you get into this field? How did all this start for you?
So I was originally in the music industry when I lived in LA, and
Doing what?
I worked for Interscope Records in the radio department, which was kind of depressing because radio was sort of dying. But it was still a really neat job. And when I worked in the music industry, I always had a heart for like wanting to help up and coming bands. And then I was really discouraged by the industry. It was wild, some of the things that happened in the office. Like there was a boss that would literally throw shoes at people when he got upset. I spent so many days like crying on the way to work because I dreaded it so much. And after after being in a position where I was helping, like, no offense, but white men who didn't really need help, I decided I wanted to go into a profession where I was helping people who really needed it.
Well put. Okay, so what happens?
So I decided on a whim to apply to grad school. And when we moved to Austin, I applied to St. Edward's here, which has a really neat counseling program. And I got in, and it was the exact right time in my life to get in. I think a week after I got into grad school, I found out I was pregnant with my first child. And so that had a huge impact on my journey in grad school and my journey as a therapist. And I think my daughter and I found each other at the right time, and I found counseling as a profession at the right time.
Okay, you just put in there a lot of information.
Yes.
So, but I want to step back. Why? Okay, you're working at this record label, people throwing shoes at one another, which sounds like a crazy boss movie.
Yes.
But why counseling?
So I guess I skipped over a little piece, which is that along with what I was experiencing at the job, so I was in my early 20s, when I was in the music industry, I also had a series of traumas happen like one after the other.
Oh.
And I was literally, I was holding so much in my body, like I was constantly in fear. I was terrified to walk my dog. Um, I wasn't able to understand like why I was struggling so much. And so I went to a therapist at the time. I hadn't been to a therapist since the therapist that I had when I was young. So she and I stopped seeing each other when I turned 18 and went to college.
Mhm.
And I hadn't been back to therapy. And um, because I had been in therapy before, I knew that that would be available to me as a tool. And I was lucky to find a sliding scale therapist. And so I found a therapist. And when I described to her all that was going on in the first session, she said, "Wow, you've experienced a lot of trauma." And
Let me interrupt. So
oh, yeah.
what did happen?
So I I'm I may not have the series of events correctly. I don't quite remember the order because of traumatized brain. Um, I was mugged one night when I was going back to my apartment. And so that became not a safe place to be. Um, and it was at knife point.
Oh God. Where was
Um,
this? In LA?
yes, in Echo Park.
Oh God.
And then uh and this one is sort of a trigger warning because it deals with uh sexual harassment that could have turned to sexual assault. I went for a job interview for a job that I found on Craigslist, and it's a very, very long story, but basically was very much sexually harassed and in a very unsafe situation. And then around the same time, I also had an abortion, which for me registered as trauma just because of the complexities of the
Mhm.
situation. And as we know, like when we're feeling isolated, that's how something stores as trauma. And so for me, even though I very much support abortion and I know I made the right decision at the time, for me, it registered as traumatic because I was feeling very alone.
Right. Yeah. I mean, wow, a lot.
A
I mean,
lot.
each one in and of themselves.
Yes.
But okay, so you go see that therapist, you share with her all the stuff going on. She sees you in a sense. Go on.
And she was the one who labeled it as trauma. And I felt like a huge wave of relief because I would not have labeled it as trauma myself. Um, just her giving me the permission to claim that those things were traumatic for me was honestly the most therapeutic part of the therapy because the rest of it didn't go so great.
Mhm.
But just her giving me that permission was so needed. And I think a huge part of why I went into being a trauma therapist myself.
So we could imagine, but why didn't you label those as trauma?
I don't think I knew what trauma was at the time.
Right. Okay.
Um, Now I am so invested in what trauma is and advocating and sharing with others what trauma is. Um, and I just didn't have that word in my vocabulary. It was not the time of social media
Mhm.
therapists.
Yep. Okay, so you go to graduate school. You want to be a therapist. What happens?
So in graduate school, I was very lucky to have some incredible professors and mentors. My professor, Sunny Lansdale, is just a brilliant trauma therapist. And I had Sunny for my human growth and development class. She shared with us about the link between trauma and attachment. And I wondered why more parents didn't know about attachment. And so that was immensely helpful for me because I was like 3 months postpartum when I took that class. And so her sharing about attachment completely probably transformed my relationship with my daughter and how I parent. So that was a big link in me wanting to work with trauma along with my own lived experience. And another wonderful trauma therapist that I got a lot of training from throughout graduate school was Julianne Taylor Shore, who's in our Austin community and is just so brilliant in how she thinks about the brain and how trauma impacts the brain and the body. And I became like almost obsessed with trauma. I should mention I am autistic, and so it sort of became a special interest of mine. Like I was just going through books and books about trauma, learning as much as I could. And then during my internship, I interned for a program called Girl Scouts Beyond Bars, which is for girls and their incarcerated mothers. So we would actually work with the girls for therapy one-on-one, and then we would go to the prison to do counseling with the girls and their mothers. And so as you can imagine, that was a huge gateway to working with trauma. And that also sparked my interests and passions, just seeing that these are really like moms who just want a mother. And most of them were really harmed by systems, and that's how they ended up in prison. But still being able to foster that attachment relationship between the girls and their mothers was really, really powerful and beautiful.
First of all, I appreciate you sharing that you're autistic. And I want to go back to something you said about attachment. You said when you found out about that, it really kind of changed your relationship with your daughter. How so?
Well, being that I was a trauma survivor and autistic, I was at very high risk for postpartum depression and did experience postpartum depression after having her. But I didn't recognize it. I just thought I was exhausted. And like, that's what happens when you're a parent because you're not getting enough sleep. And I was able, because of what I learned about attachment, to still find these ways to connect with her and to sort of not push through the postpartum depression, but to attempt to care for myself in the ways that I needed it so that I could care for her. I also think that in newer attachment research, there's a lot of things that are relieving for parents that we don't learn in the older attachment research. Like I think about Ed Tronick's book, The Power of Discord, and that fact that I always think about, where he, in his research, he found that in order to create secure attachment, we need to be attuning to the needs of children correctly 30% of the time. Of course, that doesn't mean that we should ignore them or not respond the other 70% of the time, or
Right.
Yes, it is 70%. 70% of the time. However, I think that can be such a relief so that as parents, we can offer ourselves some compassion for the times that we can't connect as deeply as we'd hoped, or the times that we do get the child's needs wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really wanted to offer that information to parents. That's another one of my specialty areas, is working with perinatal mental health and the crossover of parents who have experienced trauma, who have young kids.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my early marketing things was to do a attachment course for new parents that taught information like that.
Now, if I may ask this question, and if you don't want to talk about it, obviously we don't have to talk about it. But I'm curious. You've talked about your autism. How has that, if at all, impacted your work as a therapist?
So I was late diagnosed autistic. Over the pandemic, I realized that I didn't miss being in social situations, and a lot of my autistic traits became a lot clearer to me. And then I read the book Divergent Mind. I read it, as we often do, to help me with working with clients. And then I realized that, like, so many of the traits listed for autism were traits that I had,
Such as,
um, such as the special interests. That's always been a big one for me. I have an extreme sensitivity to noise and lights, and I get overstimulated very easily. I've masked very intensely my whole life, and so a lot of my traits have been minimized, and I'm coming into a place where I'm sort of unmasking. But I think
wait, excuse
that's,
me. So when you say I've masked, you mean you've covered up
yes,
your
covered up the traits.
certain
So
traits?
like I function pretty well in social situations, and like even like for this podcast interview, like I know how to turn it on because I know how to mask. Um, However, I get a lot of anxiety like leading up to like something like this, or I have become more prominent as like an educator, and I give presentations and I have training groups, and I get immense anxiety leading up to those things, even though I do it and I'm fine, and I can turn it on
Mm-hmm.
for the public facing things. But that's a piece of my masking. Um,
Well,
and
you're doing phenomenally, if I
thank
may
you.
say so. You're welcome.
Thank you. Um, and a huge one that I realized was also being a picky eater. I did not realize that that was a sensory thing.
Mm.
I just always thought I was just a picky eater, but I would have like a very strong aversion to foods. The first time I tried a taco, because there's so much in a taco,
Yeah.
um, my husband, not in a bad way, this might sound like too much, so I just want to give him the benefit of the doubt. He really wanted me to try and to know how amazing tacos were, and so he pushed me to so far to the brink that I cried and finally tried it. But now it is one of my favorite foods, and so I'm grateful to him for that.
There you go. You said you were late diagnosed. When were you diagnosed?
Over the pandemic.
So wow.
Yes.
Wow. So like 2 years ago.
Yes. Yeah, just about 2 years ago. Yeah, it was a huge light bulb when I read Divergent Mind, and so much came together and made sense. And a huge thing that I learned in the diagnosis process is that I have slow visual processing, which was such a light bulb moment because I always struggled with math, and like I learn a lot better through audiobooks. And there's always scratches on my car.
Mhm.
Just because I don't have good spatial recognition. And so things like that, I don't have to hold as much shame for now.
Mm. How has this, um, or yeah, talk about how this has, I don't know if helped is the right word, and maybe you can help me find a better word here, but how has this helped your work with people who've been impacted by trauma?
So I guess another trait that I didn't realize that I had, I I am extremely sensitive to other people's emotions, which of course many of us are as healers. Um, and along with being very sensitive to their emotions, I am very attuned to myself and what's happening in my body. Like I get over some, for some autistics, they get they don't have as much sensitivity. For me, I have heightened sensitivity.
Mm.
So I'm very attuned to what's happening in the room and to what's happening in myself. Um, and because because trauma became such a special interest, both because of my own lived experiences and because I was so fascinated by learning about like interpersonal neurobiology and how everything works, it almost accelerated my learning. So this was actually this was okay, I'll pause for a second because I'm sort of laughing as I talk about it. Um, I became so obsessed that I really accelerated my learning and my career almost in a way that became that like I held a bit of shame around. And now I'll say like, well, I'm autistic, so it became a special interest. Um, but I I gained uh a lot of I've had a lot of opportunities come my way that most people earlier in their career don't.
Mhm.
And a part of that uh, is because of how I accelerated my learning because I'm autistic. So that was both helpful because I became very fixated on like working with trauma is extremely sensitive. It's very easy to re-traumatize people. We're working in such a tender territory, and so I have to know it all before I do it. Um, like that's a piece of my autistic trait that's like the sense of justice. Like I I held a strong belief of like it is wrong to be working with trauma if you don't have all of the information in order to work with it, because we're dealing with so much sensitivity. Um and like I wouldn't want to be the cause of somebody's harm. So
Right.
that became really important to me, and another reason why I accelerated my learning to that extent. Um and then uh so there's that piece of it too, along with like the sensitivity that I have. I also pick up on modalities really easily, because I've learned how to mask, um, or because I've not learned how to mask, because I've always had to mask as an adaptation, I guess.
Mhm.
Um, I like, even though I'm terrified, I will not do one of the demonstrations in a training, but I'm really good at trainings. Like,
Mhm.
I'll pick up on it like that. I seem really really good at what I'm doing, but I'm terrified inside. But I learn modalities very quickly too.
Now, interpersonally, when you're working with a client, how does this play out? How have you you said, you're really attuned, you're really sensitive. That that's obviously a great thing, and that can be one thing, but interpersonally, when you're relating with someone, how does that happen for you? How does that manifest? And has that been easy or a challenge for you?
It's mostly been pretty easy. And I also tend to work with a lot of neurodivergent clients too, whether they are ADHD or autistic or uh, have sensory processing disorder. And so sometimes, like, I'm pretty, I'm I'm of the mindset that healthy self-disclosure is okay. Like, it's okay to bring your humanness into session. And so like if clients are questioning whether they're autistic, like I'll share that I'm autistic. There was like a very funny meme that was so true that said, like, therapy for autism, except you're just learning how to be more autistic. And that's what happens a lot with clients where we share neurodivergence. A lot of times it'll be a lot more like, hey, this is actually an okay thing. Like, it's okay to come more into your autistic traits instead of masking. Um, but also, like, I'll just be really aware of sometimes I do like over eye contact, um, because I always thought like you had to have intense eye contact, so it can be too much sometimes. So I'll tell
Mhm.
people like my masking is being is having like too much eye contact, so just tell me if it gets to be too much for you. And then, like, I probably do overly head nodding because of a ballet teacher I had named Paulette who told us, you always need to nod so people know that you're listening. So
Okay.
that's another thing that I probably do too much and might be awkward for clients.
How did your business come about? At what point did you say, all right, I want to create something, I want to work with people who've been impacted by trauma?
So when I was working with Girl Scouts Beyond Bars, I wanted to continue working with them after I graduated grad school, for the continuity, because so often they have therapists who are just there for a semester or two. And like when you're working with attachment and the trauma of these girls being separated from their moms, uh, it benefits them to have the continuity of a therapist.
Sure.
And so because I was not being paid for that, I sort of fell into starting a private practice under my supervisor. And because of my background in music, um, I happened to start marketing by using social media, which um when so okay, I'll back up a little. So I grew my practice fairly quickly because of my mind for marketing. And then that developed into when I completed my supervision hours, moving parts psychotherapy, uh, which first was my private practice. And then during the pandemic, my social media marketing sort of turned to mental health advocacy. And it really blew up because so many people were seeking mental health information. And so I was getting an immense influx of referrals, but I didn't have a lot of people that I felt confident referring to,
Mm-hmm.
um, just because of, I don't think there are enough people that are truly trauma informed and um, have the delicate way of thinking about trauma and uh take the like mind and body approach to healing trauma. Like we do have some great people in the Austin community, but they're all the people I would normally refer to were all full too because of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided to start a group practice where I could offer training to the clinicians in the knowledge that I had gained from my accelerated learnings, um, and really have clinicians that I felt confident referring clients to.
Let me just remind everyone that I'm speaking with Ilyse Kennedy. She can be reached at movingpartspsychotherapy.com. Um, you're pretty amazing. You know, I think that the way you're showing up and you're owning yourself and how you're uh what use I don't want to say using, but how your being, your human beingness within the work you do is really inspiring.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. um what given your knowledge and your accelerated learning and your intense study of trauma, what do you say to someone who what do you say to a therapist, a new therapist, maybe a therapist who wants to start learning about trauma? What do you say to them?
So, not everybody has to do what I did. Um, we don't have to burn ourselves out to become trauma informed. I think being trauma informed and working with trauma actually starts with examining what we hold within ourselves and knowing the way that we as humans affect what's happening for our clients, both in a negative and a positive way, like how our own stuff comes up in the room and then what we do with it, I
Mm-hmm.
think is the key piece that new clinicians um, should learn, uh, because what comes up within us can either be used to positively affect the healing, or when we don't address it, it can have a negative impact and can even cause harm. So that includes like recognizing our privilege in the room, being like if you are like a white clinician, if you're a male clinician, um, depending on your abilities, all of that affects what's happening for the client. And then how our own stuff, like our traumas, our family history, all of that is with us and with our clients in the room. And so the biggest takeaway I've had, even from the trainings that I've done and the books that I've read, is how all of my past experience, how my past experiences sit within me and how I'm carrying them with me into the work that I'm doing with clients.
Yeah, I love that. I love how you didn't say, well, you've got to read. First thing you've got to do is read Bessel van der Kolk's book. Awesome. Ilyse, super exciting and super inspiring, man. I'd love to have you back.
Thank you.
Yeah. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
So you can find me on social media at Moving Parts Psychotherapy on Instagram and unfortunately TikTok as well.
Okay.
And then I have a book coming out on November 1st.
Of course you do. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
My book is called The Tender Parts, an internal family systems guide to healing trauma.
Wow.
And it's being released on Pessy Publishing. And you can order it on Amazon.
Awesome. Ilyse Kennedy, man, you are on fire. Appreciate it. Thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
You too.